Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, many parents of school-going children face enormous costs in their daily lives in rearing their children, and the cost of living generally remains a constant pressure on them. This is compounded, made much worse, by the cost of school-going activities and the ongoing need to contribute to a school's current funding requirements. So parents are fundraising left, right and centre to pay for electricity, heating and very basic charges that schools have to meet. Now, on average, the government gives about $46,000 a year for the operating costs of a school, against an average expenditure of about $91,000. This is eaten up by lighting, heating, cleaning, insurance, classroom equipment, printing, stationery and so on. And depending on the school size, the grant of €170 per pupil can cover between 42% of a school's costs and 62%. So in other words, the smaller the school, the more medium-sized the school, the worse the hit, and are particularly disadvantaged. And what's really, I think, very poor is the treatment meted out to DEIS schools, the most disadvantaged schools. The funding gap for them is very difficult indeed, and they're hardest hit because they have far less fundraising capacity, with the most needy families and pupils attending such schools. So the funding position in relation to schools, Taoiseach, is clearly unsustainable, and this was revealed in the Grant Thornton report published last February into the current funding issues pertaining to primary schools across the country. Now, the programme for government committed to annual increases in primary and capitation grants, but the government has not implemented this commitment. And the Minister has repeated the commitment in the 2017 Action Plan for Education, 2018 Action Plan, but again, no delivery on the actual commitment. And the reason is that the government essentially is punishing schools, punishing families who fundraise. Why? Because the government feels they're taking up the slack. We don't need to add to the capitation grant. We don't need to prioritise that. Let them take it up with the various fundraising. One principal in a small rural school, for example, fundraised for 4 interactive whiteboards, 15 iPads, new windows and the conversion of a boiler house and store into a learning support room. Now, that's not an exception. That is something that's going on across the country. So rhetoric needs to be turned into reality, Taoiseach, and increased capitation grants need to be provided for in this year's budget and on a phased basis in subsequent budgets and planned. So do you accept, Taoiseach, that capitation grants are wholly inadequate to fund our primary schools at current levels? Do you accept that small and medium-sized schools and DEIS schools are particularly disadvantaged by the system? And will you commit to a generous increase in capitation grants in this year's budget as the beginning of a phased programme of increases in subsequent years? We'll be insisting on such a provision in this year's budget.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
And then the last person to lecture anyone on promises is you, because you have promised billions over the last number of months to various announcements and set pieces and so on like that. Billions, never mind 1.6 or 1.8 in terms of the NDP, in terms of whatever.
Order, please. And
it's quite extraordinary the degree to which you lecture everybody else about raising issues about expenditure. And only this morning there's another 200 million announced by 2 ministers. So please stop this mathalery about people making promises. It's absolutely within our entitlement to do this, as we did with the pupil-teacher ratio last year. Because you had resisted that, we forced the pace on reducing pupil-teacher ratio through confidence and supply last year. And we're saying very clearly that schools are in dire need. And DEIS schools in particular are in dire need because of the fact that for 3 years the government has not prioritised a commitment it made itself in terms of raising capitation grants for pupils in primary schools, and ultimately then it rests on parents
Thank you, Deputy.
to have to increase that. And in terms of the largest ever expenditure, the population is growing. As it grows, education expenditure will grow. And don't be so self-satisfied about what you're doing in school buildings, because I can bring it to any constituency in the country, including my own, and show you where there's been consistent neglect of schools that have been in the pipeline for 5 and 6 years, and some poor planning decisions made, which I'd gladly work through with you if you're interested, genuinely interested, in trying to get to the meat of the issue, and not the endless rhetoric that doesn't match reality on the ground.
Taoiseach.